Presha will give the first 30 minutes to share with us her work, and after we'll then have our discussant, whom we are going to give 10 minutes to reflect on the paper, on the presentation. Thereafter, we'll open the room for questions, comments, and contributions. So what we are going to do is start with those who are online. Those online are also welcome to put their comments on the chat box or raise their hand when the time comes for you to give the contributions. So I'll just go through the short bio I have for the presenter and the discussant. So presenter is Dr. Presha from the University of Witwatersrand, who is a director at the Center for Research, Education and Labor at the University of Wits, Johannesburg. Research interests focus on impact of climate change on the world of work, that implication this has for education, preparation for work and learning, for work and learning pathways within climate adaptive work. She is leading several research programs focusing on just transition and the impact on the world of work within Southern Africa. Presha has a deep interest in the role of vocational education and training in Africa and the access pathways for youth into intermediate work to facilitate a just transition. She is the current president for EEASA, that is the Environmental Education Association of Southern Africa. So our discussant will be Dr. Fenella Somerville, who is currently who holds the position as a researcher at Higher Education and Human Development and a lecturer in the Center for Development Support at the University of the Free State. The education role involves overseeing the restructure of Masters in Development Studies program and working with the facilitators of both the MDS and new postgraduate diploma in development studies to prepare the modules for delivery in January 2026. Her current research involves working with Prof. Melanie on the Uniplanet and Reparative Action project, which draws an actual members' notion of planetary habitability to explore the role of the university in fostering capabilities for eco-social flourishing through reparative pedagogies and lifelong learning. So these are the short bios of our presenter and our discussant. So I'll give the room to you, Dr. Presha, to share with us your presentation. We're giving you 30 minutes. At the 5 minutes to go, I'll raise up a white flag that you need to sum up so that we move on to the discussion. Over to you, Doc. You can start the presentation.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for this invitation. My name is Presha Ramsarup. So I come from the Center for Researching Education and Labor at Wits University. And what we study is education-labor market relationships. So understanding how young people transition into the world of work, the experiences within the world of work, and how we prepare people for the world of work, like we all and everyone that works in universities is involved in. Those are some of the aspects that we at Real are actually engaged in. Over the last few years, we have been doing a lot of research, trying to understand the climate crisis and the green transition more broadly, and the impact that this is actually having on the world of work, and what this impact actually means for education as well as work systems. Okay, and we've learned lots of important things over the years. We've learned in the last 10 years that the education and training system's response to environment and sustainability has been inadequate, ad hoc, fragmented, extremely reactive, and quite inefficient. And we've produced multiple research studies that work with this area. That the education and training system struggles with cross-cutting issues, and climate issues centrally fall within it. So while it's on everyone's lips and everyone's talking about the impact, it's this case of it's everywhere but nowhere. Okay. There's a strong policy commitment to sustainability and supporting sustainability, both within streams of work as well as within education and training systems. But there's a lot more actualization of these pathways within the work, especially at entry level. There's a lot more at high skill level, which is like organized professions like engineers, environmental managers, scientists, and that type of level. It is really difficult to define sustainability skills because a lot of it it occurs it's intangible, it's not clearly observable, but we have to study it in context. And today's project that I'm going to share with you, the research work that we are busy with together with our colleagues, will illustrate some of this work. Okay. And also to make the point, and I think this example today will also make it, and for the last 10 years plus, people have been saying the same thing. Relying on the market to help us to understand where skills gaps are in relation to greening the economy is actually not sustainable because, or it's not useful. There are gaps in the information that we get, and it's not the best way to try to understand it. And in the last few years, we've been trying to understand that these jobs, as we transition, they're not a homogeneous entity. We have to start to look at the jobs and the different with different lenses. And over the years, we've tried to look at what are core green jobs, what are emerging specializations in existing jobs, what are not really seen as green jobs, but they will be sustainability knowledge that needs to be integrated. At the same time, we've been doing work on, so how do we actually green a job? What does this greening mean? Are we greening fields of knowledge in the work? Are we greening the materials? Are we looking at the goods and services of the jobs? Are we looking at the products of the jobs, okay, or the tools that the jobs are working with? So we have been systematically over the years developing a research program that helps us to develop insights into these many different areas of work. So we've been trying to understand, how do we think about these jobs? What does greening an occupation mean? But what we've also seen over the years, and this is the work that I'm going to share with you today, okay, is that there are lots of jobs that we're not catching, that we're missing. Okay, so within this, there are jobs, and we look more closely. Yes, we're getting a handle to some extent on what are these green jobs, okay? But the link between green jobs and climate adaptive work, okay, which is this research program that I'm going to share with you, which is a partnership program between Wits and Rhodes. A lot of the work that we are doing in this space, we do collaboratively. And our two centers have been working collaboratively to develop a joint research program to develop clear research tools to actually research this very complex area. Okay. And what we have found over the years, that there's some jobs that are not that easy to track, that we're actually missing, that we can see the work happening. Okay. But they're not being counted as jobs. So this research project is trying to look at what we are calling climate adaptive labor, the work actually related to climate adaptation, and to raise the question, okay, where does this work actually fit? Is it work, firstly? So whereas we're able to see how greening of technology is changing work, how changing energy systems is changing work, or shifting from diesel cars to electric vehicles, or changing energy sources, we got a better handle on that. We don't understand the work that's needed to restore ecosystems, the work that's needed to clean the rivers, the work that's needed to rehabilitate wetlands, okay? And distinguishing these between, are these green jobs? Do they fall? It's been really tricky. Around the world, countries are struggling to know how to deal with these jobs, okay? Because they don't fit into neat green economy agendas. So while their environmental value is recognized, they're not fitting neatly into green economy agendas, green economy plans, or the just transition plans that are starting to emerge both at local levels and at national levels across the world. So while these jobs are starting to emerge and people are recognizing these jobs, helping us to understand the nature of these jobs is extremely difficult, and we're struggling with. Okay, so the argument that this paper, this presentation today is going to try to make is that climate change adaptation is creating forms of work and work tasks to mitigate risks that are not clearly defined as work. Nor is this climate adaptive labor visible or viable in current economic systems or the education and training systems. And our intent in this joint research program between Rhodes and Wits is, how can we understand this work better? And if we understand it better, can we then create frameworks that can help for this work to be better protected and framed as decent work? Because if it's not, and I'll show you some of the data that we've been collecting, if it's not if we don't start thinking about it as decent work, there is a potential for it to exacerbate inequality. So in this research program, we have a group of researchers across Wits and Rhodes University that are involved in researching 4 research streams. So there are 4 research streams are what this particular presentation is going to focus on. But this is within a network of other research projects that's also researching other streams. There are colleagues that are researching further water quality work. There's some colleagues researching work around e-waste and looking at the climate work emerging there. And there are other colleagues that are working at trying to understand farming at a much more granular level. So these 4 work streams, and I'll very quickly introduce them to you: water supply, rehabilitation. We've set up case studies across the country. So the Mzimvubu is in the Eastern Cape, and it's looking at rehabilitation and restoration. Water supply management is in Gauteng, and it's looking at water supply issues and technical learning compared to that, related to that. Then we're looking at climate care linked to early warning systems in KZN along the Mgeni. And then we're looking at agripreneurship, as in how do farmers take their products to the market? And what does this urban agroecology actually mean? Okay, so those are the 4 cases, together with the casework and the field work, and we've been doing fairly intensive field work. We've been hosting 4 roundtables. The first one where we tried to say, okay, so what is the nature of climate adaptive work? Can we try to put it on the table? And it gathered a large range of people involved in this work around the country, okay? And from that, we were able to do a first round of mapping, which we're now in the process of verifying with desktop research, on how are people seeing the nature of climate adaptive work? What are some of the jobs that people in various parts of the country are involved in? Then we ran a roundtable on the viability of this work, and then we looked at skills development related to the work, and we're moving from there. So what are some of the things that we are learning that is extremely important as you and me, as education researchers, start to think about this work? So we had an interfaculty seminar at Wits the other day, and lots of our research from environmental science, from our environmental science faculty, our geography development studies, we were involved in discussing some of this work. Universities employ young people across the country who are involved in climate projects, okay? Some of them, and I've been doing interviews with colleagues in KZN, some of them have actually worked on university-funded research projects for over 5 years, okay? And because of how funding evolves in these. So what are these jobs that people are actually doing? And that's what we tried to try to understand from getting a clear idea of what is the nature of climate adaptation labor. Okay, so Johnson, who's probably one person that has written about this the most, he's actually arguing that it's everyday productive and socially productive strategies that people use to manage the actual or expected impacts of climate change. So he argues that we need to look at it beyond the professionalized jobs. What are the tasks that we are doing to repair environments, to repair infrastructure, and to repair our natural production systems, right? Essa and Philip, writing in a South African context, define it more clearly as nature-based solutions to this work and work that supports ecosystem and infrastructure-based adaptation. Okay, work that looks at climate proofing, uh, physical infrastructure, wetland restoration, erosion control, coastal management, urban infrastructure. So that gives us some of an idea. In the mapping exercise that our roundtable engaged with, we came up with a whole range. So there were like over 80 people that participated in the roundtable, and they mapped on Padlets how they saw climate adaptation work in the different projects that they were engaged with across the country. Okay, and these are the big, broad focus areas that we were able to distill from it. And what our research team across the two universities are now busy with is we're trying to map what came out of those roundtables. What's the network of jobs in each of these focus areas? So in sustainable energy systems, in agriculture and food systems, what are some of the jobs? How are some of these jobs connected? So we're seeing these mind maps of jobs that are starting to emerge. Now, as we start to think about climate change labor, or climate adaptive labor, there's a lot of attention, and we know there's a lot of attention on climate adaptation. Many people are arguing on why we need to adapt and the economic benefits of climate adaptation. And you see the work emerging. You see work that's telling you so many jobs can be created by this type of climate adaptive activity. So many jobs can be created between, and I mean, DBSA and TIPS have done similar kinds of studies as well in South Africa. The one that's on the screen is actually from a biodiversity report. But this kind of work is emerging. Another kind of work that's emerging as well is the impact of climate change on workers. I was in India in January this year, and I was engaging with colleagues that are actually looking at the impact of heat stress on informal workers. Because as temperatures rise, the people that will feel it worst are obviously people that are standing at the side of the road. Okay, so the impact of climate on workers is also felt. But what is not being felt is adaptation actually work? Okay. What are the actual forms of work? And no one is actually talking, which is what this research project is trying to find, the invisible workforce that actually has to do this work. What is that workforce? Who are those workers? Okay, what are the educational needs of those workers? How are those workers protected or not protected? What are the working conditions of these workers? And our research teams have been trying to unpack some of it. So in the work so far, there's some challenges. We've been interviewing different sets of workers across the country that are involved in this work. And there's some things that we're learning. The work and this work that is happening, this climate adaptive labor, is largely invisible. While the work has social value and ecological value, there's very little market value that's seen from the world, from the work. Okay, so it's hard to count the kind of what kind of job this person's actually in. So the work itself is undervalued, misunderstood, and often precarious. Okay, because, and we know it, people work on contracts. People have to wait for the research project money to come in. Then the contracts are renewed. And sometimes that's why people describe it as stop and start work, because there could be months between the start of the end of one contract and the start of the next contract. It's not recognized as formal work, and those who perform it are frequently underpaid, unpaid, or not very free. It's NGO-funded work, largely donor-funded. The work is unrecognized, and because the word is not recognized, the occupational health and safety of workers and the protection of workers, there's very little evidence of it. Now, because it's not seen as work. And this, I've been doing some work to reconcile with all the work on just transitioning that I'm doing. It's disconnected from local economic development planning. So whereas in local government, they are doing local planning, the work that's going on related to climate adaptation is not logged or reported. So local municipalities or local governments, local entities are doing just transition plans or doing plans. But this climate adaptive work is disconnected from it. It's not seen because it's run by NGOs, it's run by different types of agencies. Sorry? Oh. It is not actually being recognized. Okay. Then the other thing that we were able to pick up, sorry, the distribution of whether this work is paid or unpaid is actually quite different, whether you're at the professional classes or planners. So where adaptation planners are actually paid, okay, environmental managers are paid. So higher skilled jobs in urban areas are paid. Lower skilled rural jobs are unpaid, poorly paid, and largely invisible. Okay, so and I think I don't know, you know, I have a colleague Monday, and we had a really good conversation about his Eastern Cape work around this. There's almost, and Sam also picked it up in the KZN case, there's this legitimizing of unpaid and poorly paid work as community contribution. So this community contribution and helping the community is actually used in a romantic way to help people and to get them to commit to a project that's actually underpaid, okay, and to accept their labor at a rate that's much lower than it should be paid. Another problem that we're able to see very clearly so far is that it's not counted in jobs because all the mechanism that we are using to understand jobs don't count this work. We do economic modeling, and these modelings are done of current value chains, with current jobs, current notions of demand. So it's obviously not picking up this kind of work. We ask employers, what skills do you need? Okay. And employers obviously largely formal industry, levy-paying employers in known sectors, formal sectors with known kinds of jobs. Again, data on these jobs we're not able to get. And Zach Esser, who's doing research around this type of work in South Africa as well, he continuously says what we actually have is a crisis of missing jobs. It's work that's happening in this country, but it's become a crisis of missing jobs. So the argument we're making is a substantial amount of climate adaptation activity is unpaid, poorly paid, and therefore invisible in traditional labor market information and statistics. Okay. And because it isn't, it cannot be budgeted for, it cannot be regulated, and it cannot be protected. And if it is not a job and I can't count you, I can't get skills funding in the skills system to actually help you to train people for the job. And that takes us to the next set of issues, which is because the work is so loosely defined and it's so ad hoc, it's driven by largely short course cultures, large levels of unaccredited training. So we're getting ad hoc pathways, fragmented pathways, training that's very dependent on funding cycles, okay, and very little occupational identity that's starting to emerge. So we're not getting young people working in these jobs that are saying, actually, I am a. So if I move from the Eastern Cape to Gauteng, or if I move from KwaZulu-Natal to Kimberley, I can't walk into a job and say, I am a this. This is the role, the work, the job experience that I actually have. So this work is not actually helping to build pathways for young people. We need much clearer ideas of occupational progression as well as to support more mobility. Okay. So how do you research climate adaptive work to make it more visible and viable? And in the research team between these two universities, we've been trying to give this a lot of thought, and we've had lots of arguments and fights and discussions around it. And what we've been doing on these sites across the country is we've tried to understand what is the climate change need, okay? And this is the kind of fieldwork framework that we've been trying to look, because how do you start to think about this as a job? What is the climate change need? What is the need in relation to climate adaptation? What are the tasks then that workers are doing to address this need? Okay, and we're capturing that data. So how can we look and cluster these work tasks to see them as job roles, as occupations, and then try to see, okay, are these job roles existing ones? Are they absent? Are they, but they could potentially be job roles, or they just little bit of additional tasks of jobs that we already know? Okay, are these jobs connected? And then what are the enabling mechanisms that we're actually going to need to support these kinds of work? And what we've been trying to develop is almost a research toolkit that we're hoping that we can get multiple other partners across the country to work with us so that we can start from the bottom up, surface this work on sites across the country so that we can get a clearer handle on it. And in this way, what we're trying to do from the bottom up is to try from the intensive field work to go to from the tasks that people are doing to see if we can map them to jobs, and then from jobs to see if we can map them to occupations, and then from occupations to try to see if we can map them to occupational qualifications. And in that way, to help to see this work, this valuable climate adaptive labor that's actually happening in these rural parts of the country, to actually surface it, to look at its viability as a job, and then to be able to do this, to say, actually, guys, this is a viable job. Okay, this is how it needs to be provisioned for in economic systems. This is how it could be seen in the education and training system, potentially or not potentially, in relation to occupational qualifications or occupational short courses. And this is the kind of bottom-up intensive research work that we've been trying to do, both from fieldwork, desk work, and these roundtable consultations where we've been engaging with people that are involved in the sectors. I'm hoping that you get. I'm going to give you a very quick, before I get waved at, a very quick example of work that our colleagues are busy with. So if we're looking at the agripreneur, and we have colleagues in the Eastern Cape and Cape Town that were doing 2 case examples of it. So from the first roundtable, we tried to map what this occupational family could potentially look like. Okay, what are some of the jobs around the country that's related to this types of work? And we mapped that. Then we've been trying to say, okay, and we surfaced agripreneurs, community gardeners, and urban farmers as a related kind of tasks that are actually happening. What are some of these occupational tasks that they're busy with? And from the data that's emerging from our young researchers' research reports, we're trying to pull out what those occupational tasks are, and then trying to see what's the core knowledge that sits behind these occupational tasks, okay? What kind of core knowledge can we see? Is there definitive core knowledge areas that define these job tasks that we can say, okay, to train people and to develop this network of jobs, these are some of the knowledge roles that are knowledge things. At the same time, what we're trying to do is to understand the current provisioning that's available for an agripreneur. And you can see we're looking at both the SACWA systems as well as the QCTO systems to try to understand what is there, what is not there. Are we able to see pathways? Okay, do we have short courses or qualifications that articulate, that enable young people to actually, okay? And at the same time, what we're trying to see is, while there are some qualifications there, what kind of knowledge is seen as core to those qualifications? Is the knowledge that's seen as core to those qualifications, does it have an integration of climate knowledge in it? Where's the potential for integration of climate knowledge? Okay. What's some of the articulation? I've said, so what's some of the knowledge components? Who are the providers? Where are these providers located? Okay, do young people across the country have access? So we're doing this provider analysis of the energy sector at the moment. And it's so overwhelming that providers in the energy sector are located in Johannesburg and Cape Town. Overwhelmingly. Okay, but we're trying to set up a whole range of energy-related things in Mpumalanga, in the Northern Cape, and in the Eastern Cape. Okay, and then we have people from Cape Town that fly in and out of Mpumalanga. So, trying to get to the kind of geospatial nuances of how the provisioning for these qualifications are actually happening. What are we seeing as some of the gaps? Okay, and where the knowledge components of climate is either covered or not covered, and what potential role then there needs to be for the QCTO as well as the CETAs in trying to help them. But our aim, guys, is particularly not to create new qualifications. That is not our interest at all. We're not interested. What we are interested in is building coherent occupational and educational pathways to ensure that these occupational and educational pathways articulate, they're coherent. A young person can move from rural KwaZulu-Natal to Cape Town, and he's able to articulate the work that he's done. And that work is recognized in the skill system as well as in the occupational system. So I hope I've tried to show you that saying, where are the jobs? Okay, what is the demand? It's actually quite a complex question, and it's not easily answered by saying, let's ask employers what they need, or let's do a modeling of future skills, or let's do a scenario planning of what is the future skills. It's a complex question, and it's a complex question that educational researchers need to deal with and to unpack, because it comes back to the educational system to say, you're not providing the right skills. You are not preparing people for a changing world of work. We need to be able to show in different contexts why this is a much more complex issue than technology has changed. We need to change qualifications. We need to understand how we build pathways in a context of uncertainty. Okay, and this is a big thing for us, is that we're training young people for, and I'm not talking about a technologically uncertain future. This is Africa. What we're uncertain about is whether we're going to have water and whether we can plant food without water. Those are the uncertainties that Africa needs to be really dealing with, okay? So in this context of uncertainty, we cannot train people for a single job. We need to understand streams of work. We need to understand pathways and job families, okay? We need to understand the stream of work, not only in terms of qualifications. Also, the work that we're doing, try to understand the occupational task, map it to a job, try to understand how the jobs are connected. That's helping us to understand the occupational pathway that young people can take. Because if those pathways are not clear, okay, young people are caught in the system because they don't know where to have. And fragmented, ad hoc kind of pathways is costly both to the individual as well as to the system. And the people that suffer most when pathways are not seamless and clear are vulnerable groups. Women, and youth with poor basic education, because they're struggling. They spend 5 years doing something because they got money from researchers from Wits University to work on a climate research project. But there's actually nothing defining what is the job that they're doing. What capacities, what is it that they actually know and are able to do now? What kind of job can they transition to? The work that they're doing is a feeder job to what type of job? Those are the things that we need to be able to surface to ensure that we actually have clear pathways for young people so that we can actually think about climate adaptive work, not in narrow ways that, oh, we need to get money for this job and we need to go and train people, and then actually we have no idea where these people can work, how it can help them to build a learning pathway, what this learning pathway could be. Okay, and I think just to quickly sum up is climate adaptive learning pathways need to be conceptualized for a stream of work, not a job. Okay, it needs coherent provisioning alongside a visible stream of work. We need to know, what are these jobs? What's the visible stream of work? So we often write, when we write about learning pathways, we say learning pathways are constituted by occupational progression as well as educational progression. These two are to come together, because the adaptive capacity, when young people don't have good basic education, all right, their adaptive capacity is constrained. When contexts change, it's difficult for them to change because they don't have the strong basic education to allow them to quickly learn short skills. Okay, top up skills, and then to be able to adapt their working context. So we need to be able to think in those ways. We need to look at multiple entry, multiple exit, both formal and informal. Okay, we need to look at pathways as well as parallel pathways. We need to understand things like what kind of signpostings on these pathways. How do people, because not only do we not, if we are struggling to understand what are these climate adaptive jobs, what are the pathways linked to them, young people know even less. The people around them don't know what these jobs are. It's not like the job of a teacher or the job of an engineer. So we need to be able to surface and make those jobs more clear. And I do not mean career. I mean making these jobs and these occupational pathways much more visible. Thank you very much. Hopefully I have not gone over time.
Thank you very much, Dom, for your passionate presentation. I believe if everything was in your powers, you would be talking something different. Now, give this next 10 minutes to Fenella to reflect on your presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Presha, thank you for a most interesting and thought-provoking presentation, and really, I think, fascinating research process. I often think that higher education and universities in particular have been an easy scapegoat to shoulder the blame for rising levels of graduate unemployment in the country. Because the critique is made that graduates do not have the skills that employers require, and institutions are to blame. And now they need to include little understood green skills. In my research on the employability of media graduates, when I asked employers what graduates required, what they required graduates have to manage a career in the industry, they didn't know, like you've said. Other than that, they should be able to adapt. High levels of unemployment in South Africa will not simply be solved by young people getting university degrees or qualifications at post-school level. It also needs fixes in the labour market and the economy. But what we are teaching for and how we are teaching is critically important. And adaptation is certainly required by government, society, industry, employers, institutions, and individuals. And climate change is teaching us this lesson. Today's presentation speaks to the need for skills systems to adapt to labour market demands and jobs related to climate adaptation. And you've presented novel ideas on alternative learning pathways and streams of work that could potentially create inclusive economic opportunities within a just transition framework. These days, everything is green. Green skills, green economy, green jobs, green transition. In a recent participatory workshop as part of our UNIPRA project, participants were asked to create a photo story about what matters to them when it comes to people-planet relationships. One of the participants wrote a story titled The Louding Voice of Green. It started, "What is your favorite color? Mine is green. Green feels safe for me. Green is sustainable. My favorite moment on the road is when the traffic lights turn green. It gives me the go feeling. I love the crunch of a crispy green salad and the green of plants and trees, the kindest things I know." It's a simple and lovely photo story about all the meaningful people, places, and things in her life associated with green. But she describes in the story how the green is fading and turning to grey, together with the air as the climate crisis asphyxiates the world. With each progressive slide in her story, the background, which started a bright green, slowly dulls to grey. But she ends with a hopeful bright green slide again, saying there is a chance for restoration if we give green a chance. Green has become a proxy for being sustainable and environmental. And as your presentation points out, it is indeed a fuzzy concept at risk of becoming a buzzword. But green needs to be a louding voice and one that we speak up for. What are green skills and green jobs? What is green inclusion? And what does green justice or green education actually look like? In July last year, a report was released on green skills and green jobs for youth. The report captures survey results from 1,108 respondents aged 18 to 35, predominantly university students or graduates from across 56 countries and 5 continents, and it presented their various reflections and understandings of green jobs and green skills. Overall, these young people understand green skills to be interdisciplinary and inclusive of both technical and softer skills. And in preparing young people for the future, they were calling for higher education systems and institutions to align with the planet's needs. They recognized that green skills and jobs must weave through multiple knowledge systems, including local and indigenous ways of knowing, and across all disciplines, not just science, technology, and engineering. For them, green jobs go beyond work on renewable energy, eliminating greenhouse emissions, and mitigating waste and pollution, but also include restoring degraded ecosystems, improving health, and supporting adaptation to the effects of climate change, which could be linked to work in your missing middle pathways. According to the student leaders reporting on the actions of universities in preparing graduates, they said, many universities are not doing enough to train and educate students, and this is across the world. Some institutions have not yet made any revision to their curricula. Some have incorporated new modules or programs themed around sustainability, but students say there is still a gap between the curriculum and the practical skills needed in the market. These students themselves recognize that universities need more resources to provide green education. It was evident from the survey that the way in which young people perceive green jobs and skills differs between and across the continents. So it is important when we address these issues that the local, national, and regional context is kept at the front of mind. When it comes to regional differences surfaced in the report, sadly, and as you have pointed out, one such is the variations in compensation in green jobs, which is higher in developed nations than in Africa and other emerging regions. The level of compensation, as you said, and job position also varies across organizations depending on their commitment to investing in green transitions. One of the students' leaders stated that overall green jobs are generally underfunded and undervalued compared to traditional corporate roles. When it comes to questions about what institutions in South Africa are doing about it, earlier this month, Vaal University of Technology convened the inaugural International Conference on Climate Resilience, Smart and Sustainable Futures, where academics and stakeholders from public and private sectors deliberated on climate change and sustainability. The conference emphasized the role of African universities in advancing climate action on the continent. However, in reading the report on the conference deliberations, what struck me was statements such as needing to fast-track clean energy development, make rapid shifts to clean energy and sustainable use of land and water, integrating sustainability into curricula, urgent rethinking and building critical skills for the green economy. They did, of course, also address the need for transformational change. Sharon Stein distinguishes between mainstream climate education, which focuses on teaching about technical problems and solutions with more Western innovations, such as renewable energy, carbon capture, and so on, and which enable green reforms of existing institutions, in which they continue to enjoy their benefits while minimizing ecological costs. And that such education should ensure students feel hopeful about an idealized future. In contrast, she says we need critical climate education that moves beyond teaching to make existing systems more sustainable, but focuses on relational and reparative responsibilities in order to interrupt climate injustices, not only in response to climate change, but also in institutions and how we teach climate education. However, transforming rigid systems and institutional processes is not going to be just, green, or sustainable if they are fast-tracked, make rapid shifts, or are integrated into existing systems. But we cannot deny the urgency. In a 2024 paper, Jaya, Surya, and Watene distinguished between just transitions as a legal obligation under international law and a moral obligation towards vulnerable states and communities. The legal obligation obviously lies in discussions around mitigation and reducing emissions, avoiding the most dangerous aspects of climate change, and moving to renewable energy and forms of adaptation with aspirations for greater justice, which is where South Africa's just transition is located. However, they contend that the only way states will succeed in the just transition aspirations is if they view the process as an opportunity for rebuilding relationships, working collaboratively, and developing partnerships. Strategies they propose include respectful and just collaboration with local communities, meeting socio-environmental responsibilities through context-dependent practices of care, so that a just transition is a collaborative concept. And it strikes me that in your work, you have been using some of those strategies. Significantly, those authors urge that urgency should not trump justice. Relationship building requires care and time. It includes values of respect, trust, consent, recognition, repair, inclusivity, and reciprocity. And I suspect that you're finding the same in your research process. In our UniPro research on best practices in university pedagogy and reparative action, we see reparative pedagogy as a repair praxis, taking action towards transformation. We've come to distinguish between transformational learning theory, which aims to be transgressive and disrupt systems and the status quo, and cross-notion of transformational learning practice that we are calling R-learning, a process which is reflective, relational, reparative, and intentional, and that importantly considers learning as a long arc of continual personal formation and development. Presha, this connects with your notions of streams of work and learning with multiple entry points and parallel pathways. Given the green transition and green jobs depend on a broader transformation of the labour force and economic systems that support green inclusion and not merely sustaining traditional systems and practices. And your presentation today shows us that it also requires creativity and innovation in how we research these things and how we understand them. A green transition must be a just transition, and just transitions must be about human development and not only economic development and renewable energy. Returning to Jaya, Surya, and Watene, they acknowledge that the fact that just transition processes require time and care is both a challenge and an opportunity. The opportunity lies in reimagining roles, relationships, education, learning pathways, and streams of work, and doing things such as you have done, which is reversing the process from the jobs to the occupation to the qualification, instead of the way we usually work the other way around. The challenge lies, or challenges lie, in agreeing, and implementation, as well as the extent to which real collaboration and genuine partnerships are built in and occur between diverse participants, not least Indigenous communities. The challenge they put out to us as readers from their article is simply to begin. And Presha, I think what you've presented us today, your work, shows us that you have done that. So thank you for your presentation. A few questions that I'm going to ask you based on it. So you're addressing an audience here that deals with higher education, and your work predominantly speaks to vocational education and occupations. So for us, terminology such as intermediate level work and occupation building is not usually linked with university education. In a country where university and high level professional jobs have been elevated to overshadow occupational programs and intermediate level work, how do we shift aspirations individually and collectively to see these learning pathways as important, appealing, and also a necessary part of societal responsibility and a moral obligation? And maybe you're going to turn around and say, well, that's more our problem than yours, but I hope not. The other question I'm going to ask is that you refer to inclusive climate adaptation and just transition planning relevant to the global south. And I wondered if you could elaborate on what that means to you. And to what extent do these pathways, the 4 pathways that you've put forward, align with just transition processes of real collaboration and genuine partnerships between diverse participants, including Indigenous communities? In other words, to make sure that they do not become new spaces for old forms of mainstream climate education. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Fenella, for that reflection. So, Doc will give you some moments to reflect on what Fenella asked before we take
Listen. The only purpose of this is to show whether the roles and functions are covered in
Was it somebody interjecting? Okay, it's okay. Yeah, so I think over to you, Dr. Presha, to reflect on what Fenella was asking before we take a couple of hands from the online and in the room.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the kind of response to some of the key ideas. I really enjoyed some of the ideas that you pulled out. I will briefly, and I'm not going to pretend to be a higher education specialist, but I don't think I've done a lot of research around professional jobs. My PhD was around a kind of professional work and linked to higher education things. So I think in terms of higher education, your question was, I would say we are all preparing people for the world of work. Every faculty at Real, we have researchers, PhD researchers from faculties across the university, from the law faculty, from the medical faculty, because they're all interested in educational preparation for the world of work, okay? And how do we think about educational preparation for the world of work is a question, I think, for higher education researchers as well as vocational education. I think that for a long time, there was this, and that does not mean that higher education, I am suggesting that they're preparing people for what employers need, because I don't believe that's the role of a university. But I do think that you're preparing people for a changing world of work. You're preparing people for a stream of work where they have the adaptive core knowledge that allows them to adapt as different things, and climate being one very important part of that, and what does that mean? How is climate integrated into that? So I think that as higher education researchers, and I know that yourselves as well as our center and our colleagues at the LRC, we're involved in multiple different higher education and climate related research programs at the moment, all trying to understand what is the transition into the world of work going to mean for students as they leave? So I think those are all aspects that higher education, and I know that your question was very complex, I don't think there's a definite answer to it, but I think that these are issues higher education researchers need to be, because in a way, we are teaching core knowledge for a world of work, okay? A world of work that's changing, a world of work that we need to think about what is, and this we talk about a lot at our center, what is the core knowledge here, okay? What is the disciplinary kind of root of this work? And then how do we think about adaptive capacity in relation to that, okay? So I think that those are some of the issues that higher education researchers should be thinking about. The second thing I think is extremely important for higher education researchers to be thinking about, and probably some traditional higher education researchers will not agree, is in a country with such high levels of youth unemployment, we should be thinking about parallel pathways. What are the different ways for people to access jobs into these areas of knowledge? Okay, how do we scaffold these areas of knowledge so people can access them in different routes? And we at our center have been trying to do that with some engineering studies. We've been trying to do it with environmental sciences. We've been trying to see what are the parallel routes. They are the traditional routes where you finish, you do well at school, and you'll come to do a BSc adverts in environmental sciences. But if you don't, and they're parallel routes, where are these bridging pathways? How are these pathways? That's how we've been studying some of the high-skilled professional areas of work as well, if that gives you any kind of insight. So in terms of, I have my own, because of course we've been very involved in a lot of the just transitioning spaces, which is why we're asking the kinds of questions that we are, as well as the types of questions that we ask in the just transitioning spaces. Trying to understand the directionality of the transition. So African, to me, how we bring it back to the global south is to actually look at how these issues are linked back to socioeconomic issues, how they link back to socio-ecological issues, how they link back to an issue you raised as well, to indigenous knowledge systems, how it's raised back to making communities the center of the transition and not technology. Which is an argument that we're always making in the just transitioning spaces, that the transition is built on the shoulders of our communities. So to actually understand the role of the community and the centrality of the communities in the transition, to me, those are some of the things, and to bring African agendas in. Sorry, I just need water. So my point about, and I always get into trouble, this is not a transition about technology, okay? In a country that has no water, in a country that is facing questions of how do we plant food without water, we can't allow it to be a transition around technology change, okay? And we can't use the just transition to allow the technology change to drive how we make educational decisions for young people in Africa, most of which are actually left out. So, of the whole technological approach in the shift. So I hope I've given you some kind of aspects around some of the questions that you answered. But I don't know if there are any other questions that some of your colleagues may have.
Okay, thanks, Doc, for that. I see I think we'll just take one because of our time, actually. Maybe bear with us, we have 5 extra minutes so that at least we can have 2 reflections. So there's Shalem, who raised up their hand, and maybe before you speak, I also just read the one comment from Montusi, who's saying social value and ecological value, but no no market value, maybe because, like we have indicated, depends largely on grants funding and NGO, etc. So then he's saying, relating to the above, what would you say to the idea that there is a deliberate intention to green jobs, occupation, have no market value, to keep them unrecognizable, and maybe because the efficiency and market value of some of the green jobs would be detrimental to major industrial players. Hence, they keep these occupations appearing like volunteerism and community work. Then maybe let's just save these two, this comment, and then Shalem also, then you respond both of them at once. Shalem? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Presha, for the nice and clear presentation. I just want to add, it's not a question, I just want to add that from the work that we've done, for example, in the field of agriculture, and there is a, whether we go into kind of a high-level discussion of climate change and organic farming or not, it is happening everywhere, but it's happening in small scale in South Africa. And what we saw is that, and I'm not going into the working conditions of these people and so on, but a lot of the people that that we cover in our work are people that, young kids that have matric and try and move a little bit forward, and are working, some of them are working in regenerative farming. So what we then looked at and see what could be the pathway that they can take at school, from school, and higher than school. In other words, what is offered in schools at level below matric, and what is offered after matric. And so that it's not like that there are no qualifications. There are qualifications, but what is missing, particularly from the level 2 and 3 and 4 qualifications, is content knowledge that is related to climate change. There is a sense that we get that that those qualifications include stuff on kind of how to market your product and businesses and so on. But the awareness around climate change is not going to happen if that content is not going to include. So it's be included. So it's not about it's not about getting more qualification. It's about thinking about what exists and see how you can bring into those qualifications understanding of climate adaptation and change related things. And this is really, really important, even more so in climate care, where most of the work is done by volunteers that are putting themselves in danger because they don't often know what to do. So again, it's not necessarily about more qualification. It's about enriching the content, both in relation to marketing, which is kind of in the public consciousness, but now we also have to now put a related issue to climate care.
Mm. Yeah, thanks. That was a comment. So I think that the what I tried to, I mean, in terms of making the work more visible, I think that, sorry, and Fenella, I actually thought about one other thing, which I kind of said in my presentation, but I thought I'd make. I think that universities are a huge culprit of precarious work of young people in all of the climate projects that we're running. Because and I'm not saying that because my own university and my own, so we've done interviews with climate-related programs that are employing young people ad hoc jobs related to this kind of community climate program, that kind of community, and they represent it as community learning, okay? But and they write a lot about community learning and but actually what they're engaging in is keeping. And some people that I've met through some of linked to, because I've interviewed quite a few different academics and through their climate programs and the young people that work on the ground on those programs. Some of them have been linked to these programs for 5 years on ad hoc contracts. Obviously, like you, like me, and you, and all of our centers, depending on the grant fundings that we get. But it's also about an awareness of how the position that we're taking around the pathways of these young people in the climate work and the justice related to the climate work that we're doing, because it becomes an integral part of how precarious is the work, okay? What opportunity is it creating? Where can these young people go to? And those are some of the conversations that I've had with multiple different university academic climate programs and trying to understand, okay, so if we're going to move this young person from here to there, right, what kind of adaptive capacity will be actually needed? And how do we start to think about that in our designing of these programs as well? I think that there's a lot of thinking that has to happen. And I don't think I have a solution. I'm not, by no means, because I think the easiest way to get access to these young people were through people that I knew were running big climate programs. Okay, so started with some of our colleagues at Wits University, some at Rhodes University, some at UKZN, and some at Stellenbosch. And they all are operating similar ways. So I think that it is important as well to think about the young person that's working on climate programs. And when we're talking about community participation, community learning, co-learning, you know, or co-generation of knowledge, what that actually means in terms of justice to communities and justice to young people. That was the, sorry, you know, and you get things pop out in and out of your head. That was another point that I think universities need to be wary of. And then I think that the work to the point, it is, we're trying to make the work more visible. If we can count this as a job, okay, if we can find a way to represent it as a job, it can be counted in a labor force survey, hypothetically. It can be counted by the way a local economic development plan. So we've been doing that type of work, and that's how you make the work more visible. And I think that there's a longer term, and there are a couple of colleagues who would argue what we need is a new economic system. Of course, we need a new economic system. Okay, but that's not going to happen next year or in the next 5 years. So we're trying to see how can we make this work more visible in both economic systems and education and training systems. And if we can do that, then we can start to count the young people that are in these jobs. We can count them as jobs. It's step one in the issue around visibility and viability. But I think it's an important question around visibility and the issue of visibility and viability.
But I think
A short one.
a short comment. And
Yeah.
Thanks, Presha. And I also think you're absolutely right. I mean, but I also think it's important. It's not just from the institution side. It's not just about content, but also about developing values of care and reciprocity and eco and social justice, for them to want to actually go into these pathways and stay.
No, absolutely. Fully agree.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. for your presentation. And seemingly there's quite a lot of people who are interested in engaging, but we've gone beyond our time by 10 minutes. So what we're going to do, I think we'll just have an in-house discussion, and so we'll be taking some of the key comments that they might raise towards the presentation. Then Dr. Diaz will be able to liaise with you and maybe share if you want to engage into them further. So at this time, I will say thank you, and we appreciate the presentation.
Thank you so much, colleagues, and thank you for the invitation. And I look forward to maybe meeting all of you one day. And yeah, if you're happy to be interviewed, drop me an email. And I'd really like to hear about the young people that work on some of your programs and how they've created pathways. Maybe and they have been young people that have managed to create pathways, so I'm really would be very keen to hear. And Fenella mentioned some of the climate programs, so maybe I'll drop you an email as well to hear some of that work as well. Thank you, guys. Thanks again for the invitation. Look forward to meeting you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.